Napoleon Bonaparte fought 60 major battles in his career and won 47 of them, a win rate that no commander in this series, ancient or modern, has matched. But the battles were never the point. Napoleon himself said in the final years of his exile on St. Helena that he expected history to remember the Napoleonic Code, the Banque de France, and his reform of French administration long after his battles were forgotten. He was, underneath the bicorn hat and the famous silhouette, a builder of institutions who happened to be extraordinarily good at war. Now, having taken Baltimore in a campaign that ended not with tribute, but with a list of requests, a library, a meeting with a Treasury official, a flag he wanted to see, Napoleon's Grande Armée is marching on Washington, D.C. He is not coming for the White House. He has been explicit about this with his marshals, who find the distinction strange coming from a man who once crowned himself emperor in front of the Pope. He is coming for the Library of Congress, the largest library in human history, and for a conversation with the Treasury Department about how a 250-year-old country built a financial system that has not collapsed once in 250 years. A claim that, as Napoleon points out to anyone who will listen, France cannot make about any of its institutions, including the ones he personally built. The Grande Armée's march from Baltimore to Washington, D.C. follows the general route of modern E-95 and the Baltimore-Washington Parkway, 40 miles of corridor that Napoleon's chief of staff, Marshal Berthier, has mapped with the same precision applied to every road network in every campaign the Grande Armée has ever conducted. 80,000 soldiers moving in corps formation, the artillery train stretching for miles, the Imperial Guard at the center with Napoleon. The Joint Chiefs of Staff at the Pentagon, who have now coordinated responses to Spartans, U.S. versus ancient empire scenarios, and now a fully modern early 19th century army with an unbroken record of European conquest, hold a briefing at 0500 that the chairman opens with a line that becomes, within hours, the most quoted sentence of the entire campaign. Gentlemen, we have fought commanders who didn't know what helicopters were. We are about to fight a commander who would understand exactly what a helicopter is, on exactly why we have one, and exactly how to take away the thing it needs to fly. The assessment is not wrong. Napoleon's intelligence officers, briefed by captured information from the Baltimore campaign and by the same after-action report sharing arrangement that every previous invader in this series has benefited from, have already identified that American air power requires fuel depots, and fuel depots require supply lines. And supply lines are the one thing Napoleon Bonaparte has spent 20 years learning to disrupt. The Grande Armée's vanguard reaches the National Mall at 0900, and Napoleon, riding at the front with the Imperial Guard, stops the column at the eastern end near the capital for almost as long as Alexander the Great once stopped, 2 cities and 1 fictional season ago, to look at the same Greek-inspired architecture. Napoleon's reaction is different, and it is different for a specific historical reason that his aide-de-camp, a young captain who studied art history before the wars, articulates as the column waits. Napoleon did not just admire Greek and Roman classical architecture from a distance, the way the Spartan general or Alexander might have. He deliberately built an empire styled on it. The Arc de Triomphe, the Vendôme column, modeled directly on Trajan's column in Rome, with a statue of Napoleon himself at the top, dressed as a Roman emperor. The entire aesthetic program of the Napoleonic Empire, the eagles, the laurel wreaths, the triumphal arches, was a conscious act of imperial cosplay, an attempt to dress the French Revolution's chaotic energy in the borrowed legitimacy of Rome. Napoleon looks down the National Mall at the Capitol Dome, or the obelisk of the Washington Monument, the Doric columns of the Lincoln Memorial in the distance, and says to his aide, "I did this too." The aide says, "Yes, sire." Napoleon says, "Did it work for them?" The American response to Napoleon presents a problem that none of the 5 previous U.S. military versus ancient empire engagements presented, and the Joint Chiefs identify it within the first 4 hours. Napoleon is not an ancient commander improvising against weapons he has never conceived of. He is, in the assessment of the Pentagon's own historians consulted overnight, the single most important bridge figure between pre-modern and modern warfare in European history, the inventor of the core system that the U.S. Army's own organizational chart still echoes, the man whose campaigns are still taught at West Point not as curiosities but as foundational case studies in maneuver warfare, the targeting decision that every previous campaign has forced on an American commander, the moment where a Hellfire missile or an artillery strike could end the engagement instantly by removing the enemy commander, arrives for the Joint Task Force commander overseeing the D.C. defense within the first hour, and his answer, when his executive officer asks the question directly, channels the same instinct that every previous American commander in this series has reached independently. He says, "We are not going to be the army that's remembered for assassinating Napoleon Bonaparte in his sleep. We're going to beat him fighting." His XO says, "Sir, with respect, we have beaten everyone we've fought in this series." The commander says, "We've also never fought someone whose biggest defeats came from his own mistakes rather than the other side's brilliance. Let's not be his Waterloo by accident. Let's earn whatever this is." What Napoleon's intelligence staff identifies by midday, working from the after-action reports of all 5 previous American engagements that have been compiled into what the French General Staff is now calling, with characteristic bureaucratic precision, the American Pattern Document, is the single insight that defines the entire D.C. campaign. Every previous engagement, Mongolia, Italy, the North Sea, Egypt, Persia, ended the same way. The Americans won every direct battle and then ran into the wall of their own logistics. Ammunition, fuel, time. Napoleon, who personally destroyed his own Grande Armée in Russia by failing to solve exactly this problem, outrunning his own supply lines into a hostile country with no way to replenish, reads this pattern and recognizes it immediately because it is the same trap he fell into in 1812, just inverted. He says to Marshal Berthier in the command tent established within sight of the mall, "They are doing to themselves in every battle what Russia did to me. They are too far from home, with too little to resupply with, fighting an enemy who has nowhere else to be." Berthier says, "Then we wait them out, sire, the way the Russians waited us out?" Napoleon says, "No, waiting cost me an army and a winter. We do something faster." He pulls out the map of the mall and the surrounding federal district. He says, "We take the thing they cannot resupply at any speed, time itself. We make this expensive and slow is the one weapon I have that their helicopters don't." What Napoleon executes over the following 36 hours is not a battle in any conventional sense, and it confuses the American command structure precisely because it is designed to. The Grande Armée does not advance on any defended position. It establishes itself across the National Mall and the surrounding federal district in the most extensive fortified encampment any invading force has built in this entire series, more extensive than the Roman circumvallation, more deliberate than anything the Mongols or Spartans constructed, and then it simply administers the territory it occupies. Napoleon's engineers want the same engineering corps that built pontoon bridges across the Danube and the Niemen, construct field fortifications around the Smithsonian Castle, the National Archives, and the approaches to the capital within 18 hours. But the soldiers inside those fortifications are not preparing for an assault. They are, in scenes that the American drone surveillance describes with genuine confusion in their reports, conducting drills, maintaining equipment, and, in detail that becomes the most discussed image of the entire campaign once it leaks to the press, running what appears to be an actual functioning field school, with junior officers being lectured by senior ones on tactics and law, the same way Napoleon insisted on training and promoting his own army based on merit rather than aristocratic birth. The Joint Task Force commander, see watching this on his morning briefing, says to his intelligence officer, "He's not besieging us, he's just living here." His intelligence officer says, "Sir, I think that might be worse." The formal request for access to the Library of Congress arrives at the Joint Task Force command post at 700 on day 2, delivered by a French officer under a flag of parley, exactly as the request was foreshadowed at the end of the Baltimore campaign. The request itself, translated and transmitted up the chain of command to the White House within the hour, is unlike any communication received from any invading force in the history of the United States. It is a formal letter, in Napoleon's own hand, as confirmed by handwriting analysis run by the FBI within 40 minutes out of sheer institutional disbelief, requesting supervised access to the Library of Congress, reading rooms for a period of 7 days, citing his personal historical interest in the collection's holdings on American constitutional law, the history of the Louisiana Purchase, which Napoleon himself sold to Thomas Jefferson in 1803 for $15 million, doubling the size of the United States overnight to fund his European wars, and what he describes, through his interpreter, as the architecture of a republic that has not yet destroyed itself. The president, briefed on the request by the National Security Advisor, asks the only question that matters: is this a trick? The Librarian of Congress, consulted directly by phone, says something that ends up defining the administration's entire response to the rest of the campaign. "Madam President, the man sold us Louisiana, so I think we can let him read some books." Napoleon enters the Library of Congress's Thomas Jefferson building on day 3 with an escort of 4 French officers, 2 Secret Service agents, and the Librarian of Congress herself, who has canceled every other appointment for the week. He stops in the Great Hall before reaching the reading rooms, the building's marble staircases, mosaics, and the dome above the main reading room, completed in 1897 in a Beaux-Arts style that is, the librarian explains, itself deeply indebted to French academic architectural training. Napoleon looks up at the dome for a long moment and says, "Of course it is." He spends the first day almost entirely in the section devoted to the Louisiana Purchase, reading, through his interpreter, Jefferson's own correspondence about the negotiation, the original treaty documents, the Senate debates over ratification. He learns for the first time what happened to the territory after he sold it, the full westward expansion, the states it eventually became, the scale of the country it produced. His interpreter records his reaction in a private journal entry that surfaces years later. He sat with the documents for 40 minutes without speaking, and when he finally looked up, he said only, "I sold them an empire to pay for a war I eventually lost anyway." Then he asked for the next folder. The meeting with the Treasury Department happens on day 4 at the Treasury Building, the Greek Revival structure directly beside the White House, and it is, by the unanimous account of everyone present, the strangest economic seminar in American history. The Secretary of the Treasury, a former central banker who has spent her career studying monetary policy and financial stability, sits across from the man who founded the Banque de France. And what follows is less a negotiation than a professional exchange between two people who have spent their careers solving versions of the same problem from 200 years apart. Napoleon asks about the Federal Reserve's independence from the executive branch, a structural feature that genuinely fascinates him, since the Banque de France he created remained, by design, subject to his personal authority. He asks about the gold standard's abandonment in 1971 and what replaced it. He asks, in the question that the secretary later describes in her memoir as the one that actually unsettled me, whether the United States has ever, in 250 years, I defaulted on its debt. And when she says no, not once, he is quiet for nearly a minute before saying, France has defaulted, in one form or another, 6 times since I died. I did not know that when I was alive. I am not sure it would have changed anything I did, but I would have liked to know it. By day 5, Napoleon's daily routine has settled into something that the American security detail assigned to monitor him, now numbering nearly 200 personnel, the largest close protection and surveillance operation ever mounted against a foreign head of state, living or dead, describes in their daily reports with a mixture of professional thoroughness and genuine bewilderment. He rises at 4 a.m. as he always has. He spends 3 hours with documents from the Library of Congress, delivered to his field headquarters under armed Smithsonian and library escort each evening, and returned each morning. He inspects his troops at 7 a.m., maintaining the same standards of discipline and drill he has enforced since 1796. He spends afternoons in further meetings, a session with the Supreme Court Justice about the structure of judicial review, a conversation with the Smithsonian's chief historian about the National Archives' preservation techniques for the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence, a walk through the National Museum of American History's Political History Wing, where he stands for nearly 20 minutes in front of a display case containing Thomas Jefferson's writing desk. His aide-de-camp's journal entry for day 5 reads, "The Emperor has not mentioned the army in 2 days. I do not believe he has forgotten it exists. I believe, for the first time since I have known him, he has found something more interesting than conquering it." The withdrawal negotiation, when it finally happens on day 6, is almost an afterthought to everything that has preceded it. And the President, meeting Napoleon in person for the first time in the cabinet room of the White House, a choice of venue that Napoleon specifically requests because he wants to see, in his words through the interpreter, the room where the decisions are actually made, not the room for ceremonies, finds the negotiation oddly easy. Napoleon asks for nothing material. No territory, no tribute, no formal acknowledgement beyond what has already been freely given. He asks for one symbolic gesture, that a copy of the Napoleonic Code, the legal framework he is most proud of among everything he built, be added to the Library of Congress's permanent collection alongside the founding American documents, not as a curiosity but as what he calls, through the interpreter, a fellow attempt at the same problem. How does a republic, or whatever a country decides to become, write down what it believes a person is owed by the law? The President agrees within the hour. The Librarian of Congress, informed of the request, says it is the easiest acquisition decision she has made in her tenure. Napoleon, hearing this relayed back to him, says, "Good. Then we are finished discussing the parts that matter to history, and we can discuss the parts that matter to logistics." The Grande Armée withdraws from Washington, D.C. on day 7, marching south along the same route it used to arrive. The column moving past the Smithsonian, past the Capitol, out toward the Maryland state line, and the long road back to the Chesapeake Bay where the fleet waits. Napoleon rides at the rear of the column, as he did leaving Baltimore, and as the column passes the Library of Congress's Jefferson building for the final time, he stops his horse, the only stop of the entire withdrawal march, and looks back at the building for nearly 5 minutes. His aide-de-camp, riding beside him, finally asks the question that has been sitting unspoken between them since day 5. "Sire, was it worth the campaign, to come all this way for books and meetings rather than territory?" Napoleon considers the question with the same seriousness he gives to questions of actual strategy. He says, "I spent 20 years conquering territory, and most of it was lost again within a generation of my death. I spent 7 days here reading about a country that has kept its founding documents, its founding bank, and its founding laws essentially intact for 250 years without a single successful coup against the system itself. He turns his horse forward. He says, I am beginning to suspect that the thing I should have studied harder was not how to win wars, it was how to make something that survives losing them. 2 campaigns into the Napoleon series, a pattern is emerging that distinguishes this commander from every other figure who has appeared across every previous series on this channel. The Mongols, the Romans, the Spartans, Rameses, Alexander, every one of them, when confronted with the modern world, asked questions rooted primarily in military and tactical curiosity. What can your weapons do? How do your soldiers train? What is the range of your thunder? Napoleon, across 2 campaigns, has asked almost none of those questions because he already understands with uncomfortable clarity that his army cannot match the Pentagon's technology and that no tactical insight will change that fact. What he has asked about instead is something only he, among every commander in this entire channel's history, was positioned to ask, because he is the only one whose own legacy is institutional rather than purely military. He built a legal code, a bank, a road network, a university system, and an entire administrative apparatus that, in places, survives in recognizable form 200 years after his death. And what Washington, D.C. revealed to him, across 7 days of reading documents and meeting officials, is the uncomfortable possibility that the country he came to study, founded by men who fought one war and then spent the rest of their lives building institutions designed specifically to never need another Napoleon, may have simply solved the problem he spent his entire life trying to solve and never quite finishing. He took an empire. They built a system that has outlasted every empire that has ever looked at it twice. Subscribe, because part 3 is coming, and Napoleon has a city in mind that he says reminds him of nothing so much as Paris before the Revolution.